It all started on an overcast afternoon. The sky hung low with heavy clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. The playground was empty except for a few kids, their laughter thin and nervous, as if the weight of the clouds pressed down on them too. Principal Harris stood by the office window, sipping stale coffee and wondering if he should give the old trees a trim. The woods behind Maple Grove Elementary had always been dense and dark, but recently, they seemed to have grown thicker, as if the trees were trying to keep secrets. That was the afternoon Emily Larson came into his office. Emily was a quiet girl, with big eyes and braids that always seemed to come undone by lunchtime. She shuffled in, clutching the straps of her backpack, her face pale. Principal Harris noticed her eyes darting to the window, towards the woods. "What's wrong, Emily?" he asked, trying to sound reassuring. "There's someone in the woods," she said. "He whistles." "A whistler?" Harris frowned. "What do you mean?" "Every time we play near the edge of the playground, we hear it," Emily whispered. "A soft tune, like someone calling us. I thought it was just a game, but today, I saw him." "You saw someone?" Emily nodded. "He was standing between the trees, not moving, just watching us, and he kept whistling. He said, 'Come closer. I won't hurt you.'" A chill ran down Harris's spine, but he forced a smile. "Emily, sometimes our minds play tricks on us. Maybe it was just a shadow, or a tree branch moving in the wind." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't a shadow. He's real, and he's out there." She left the office, her footsteps soft against the carpet. Harris rubbed his temples. Kids had wild imaginations. This wasn't the first time a child had come to him with a story. But there was something in Emily's eyes that made him uneasy, a kind of fear he hadn't seen before. That night, he went home and tried to forget about it. But he couldn't. The stories started to spread. Over the next few days, more children came forward. Different grades, different friends, but the same story. "He's in the woods," one boy, Timmy, said. "He's tall and thin," another girl, Clara, whispered. "And he's always smiling. He says, 'Come closer.'" Evan, one of the older kids, muttered, "But I'm scared if I do, I won't come back." Principal Harris listened, each story pulling at the edges of his sanity. He wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to some shared hysteria or elaborate prank. But the descriptions were too consistent, too detailed. Then Evan's mother called. "Mr. Harris?" Her voice trembled over the line. "Evan's not sleeping. He won't go near the windows. He says he hears the whistling in his dreams. And last night, he woke up screaming that the man was outside his room." Harris's blood ran cold. That was when he decided to investigate for himself. The woods behind the school had always been dense, but as Harris stepped into the tree line, it felt suffocating. The air was damp, filled with the smell of moss and decaying leaves. His footsteps crunched softly as he moved deeper, the sounds of the school fading behind him. He told himself he was being ridiculous. There was no man in the woods. There was no whistler, just shadows and the imagination of children. But then he heard it, a faint, melodic whistle, threading its way through the trees. Harris froze. The tune was soft, almost gentle, but something about it felt wrong, like a spider spinning silk around a fly. "Come closer," a voice whispered. He turned, his heart hammering. But there was no one there, just trees and shadows. He took a step back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The whistle stopped. The forest fell silent. And then he saw it. Between the trees, a figure stood motionless, tall, unnaturally thin, with a smile stretched too wide across a pale face. The eyes were dark voids, empty and endless. "Come closer," the figure whispered again, its voice a rasping promise. Harris turned and ran, the branches tearing at his clothes, the whistle echoing behind him. The moon was a thin crescent when Harris returned to the woods. This time, he brought a flashlight and a sense of dread so heavy it nearly pinned him to the earth. The police search for Evan had turned up nothing, and Harris knew that if he didn't find answers soon, more children might vanish. The whistle began again, a haunting melody that seemed to follow him. He pushed forward, driven by equal parts fear and desperation. Then he saw it, a dilapidated cabin, hidden deep within the forest. The windows were shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. He stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Scratches lined the walls, tiny handprints smeared with dirt. The faint whisper of "come closer" seemed to drift from every corner. In the center of the room lay a tattered journal. He picked it up, his hands trembling as he read the final entry. Asterisk, I called to them. I didn't mean to, but he won't let me leave. He makes me call others, or he takes me back to the darkness. Please, forgive me. The signature at the bottom read, Peter Whitlock. Asterisk. Harris's flashlight flickered, and then he heard it, the whistle now right behind him. He turned slowly, the beam illuminating that same pale face, the same void-like eyes. Come closer, it whispered. The light went out, and Harris screamed. The search parties never found Principal Harris. But sometimes, late at night, the children of Maple Grove still hear a soft, eerie whistle coming from the woods, and a new voice calling, Come closer. Black Hollow was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. Nestled between misty hills and ancient forests, it was a quiet place where everyone knew each other's business. But as of late, something strange had crept into the town's peaceful routine. It started with the fog, thicker than usual, swirling around the narrow streets, clinging to the edges of the old forest. The children whispered about the fog piper, a figure they claimed to see when the mist was at its heaviest. Lisa Hart, the new sheriff in town, dismissed it as campfire gossip. She'd moved to Black Hollow to escape the chaos of city life, not to chase ghost stories. But when 3 children disappeared in the span of 2 weeks, their shoes found near the forest's edge, she knew something was horribly wrong. Lisa's latest visit was to the Thompsons. Their daughter, Mia, had vanished the night before. The girl's room was untouched, the window open just a crack. Mia's not the type to run away, Mrs. Thompson sobbed. She kept saying she heard music in the fog. We thought it was just a dream. Lisa stared at the open window. The mist curled outside like living tendrils. She shivered. That night, Lisa decided to patrol the forest's edge. The cold air bit at her cheeks, the fog so dense her flashlight barely penetrated it. The world felt muffled, the quiet unnaturally deep. And then she heard it, a faint, haunting melody, threading its way through the mist. It was a slow, lilting tune, like a lullaby played on an old flute. The sound tugged at something deep inside her, an urge to follow, to step into the fog. Her feet moved before her brain registered it. The music was drawing her in, pulling her toward the treeline. For a moment, she glimpsed a figure ahead, a tall silhouette holding what looked like a flute, standing perfectly still. The figure raised a hand and beckoned. Lisa stumbled back, the spell breaking. Her heart pounded as she turned and ran, the music fading behind her. Lisa gathered the townsfolk the next morning in the community hall. Fear was etched on every face. We're dealing with something dangerous, she said, her voice firm. Something that uses the fog to lure children away. We need to stay vigilant. An old man at the back of the room cleared his throat. The piper has returned, he muttered. The piper? Lisa asked. My grandfather used to warn us, the man said. The piper comes with the fog. He plays his song, and the children who follow him are never seen again. Why does he take them? Someone whispered. To replace the ones he lost, the old man said. They say he was a man who lost his own children to the forest long ago. Now he wanders the mist, forever searching. Lisa's stomach turned. Ghost stories or not, she needed to act. That night, Lisa stood at the forest's edge, the fog thicker than ever. She took a deep breath and stepped in. The music started almost immediately, weaving through the trees. Her flashlight flickered, and she felt that same pull, that insistent urge to follow. But this time, she was ready. She walked toward the music, each step deliberate. The figure of the piper emerged, his back to her, the flute at his lips. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered clothes that seemed to blend with the mist. "Let them go," Lisa called out. The piper lowered the flute and turned. His face was hollow, eyes empty sockets that stared through her. "They are mine now," he whispered, his voice like dead leaves rustling. "No," Lisa said, her voice shaking but firm. "They don't belong to you." The piper's mouth twisted into something like a smile. He raised the flute again, but before he could play, Lisa lunged forward and grabbed it. The world seemed to ripple. The piper let out a terrible, hollow wail, the fog swirling violently around him. And then he began to dissolve, his form unraveling into the mist until there was nothing left but silence. Lisa stumbled out of the forest, the first rays of dawn piercing the thinning fog. And there, emerging behind her, were the missing children, Mia, the Thompson girl, and the others. Their eyes were wide, confused, but alive. The town rejoiced, but Lisa knew the piper's story wasn't truly over. The flute she'd taken lay cold and heavy in her hand. She buried it deep in the woods that day, hoping to lock away the piper's power forever. But sometimes, when the fog rolled in thick, she swore she could still hear a faint melody drifting through Black Hollow, and she wondered if the piper was really gone. Weeks passed, and the town of Black Hollow slowly returned to normal. The children were home, the fog less dense, but an uneasy feeling lingered. One evening, Lisa was at her desk, finishing reports, when her phone rang. It was Mrs. Thompson. "Sheriff, Mia's been sleepwalking," she said, her voice shaking. "She keeps whispering about music." Lisa's heart dropped. Before she could respond, a soft, familiar whistle sounded through her open window. She turned toward the darkening woods. The fog was rolling back in. The town of Wrenwood sat on the edge of Lake Desolate, a body of water so dark and still it seemed to absorb all light. The lake's name was no accident. There were stories of boats vanishing, fishermen never returning, and strange reflections flickering on its surface. Sheriff Mark Davidson had lived in Wrenwood his entire life. He knew the myths, the campfire tales told to keep kids from wandering too close to the water. But he never paid them any mind. At least, not until the children started disappearing. It began with Kyle Manson, a boy of 8. One moment he was skipping stones near the lake's edge, and the next he was gone. His footprints led to the water and then stopped, as if he'd been plucked off the earth. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, just the still water, reflecting a gray sky. 2 days later, it was Mia Thompson, then Lucas Reed. Sheriff Davidson stared at the lake from his patrol car. The fog had rolled in again, clinging to the surface like a wet sheet. He felt a chill that went beyond the damp air. Something was wrong. The lake was hiding a secret, and he was going to find out what it was. Mark decided to patrol the lake that night. He took out the old motorboat the town used for rescue missions, its engine sputtering to life reluctantly. The fog was thick, swirling around him as he moved deeper into the lake. The beam of his flashlight pierced the mist, but it was like shining light into a cloud. The fog swallowed it whole. He kept his ears open, listening for anything unusual. Then he heard it, a child's voice, distant and muffled. "Help! Help me!" Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He swung the flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing. The voice drifted across the water, tantalizingly close. "Kyle? Mia?" He called out, his voice shaky. The fog thickened, and the temperature dropped sharply. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, help." Mark's fingers tightened on the wheel. He guided the boat toward the sound, the motor's hum growing quieter as he eased forward. Then he saw it, a small hand breaking the surface of the water, pale and unmoving. He lunged forward, plunging his arm into the freezing water. His fingers grazed the hand, and then nothing. The hand slipped away as if it had never been there. The water stilled, mocking him with its silence. "No," he muttered, leaning over the side, his breath coming in frantic bursts. Then a whisper floated up from the depths. "Mark, come closer." He froze. The whisper was cold, wrong. Not the voice of a child, but something older, something that knew his name. He looked down into the water. His reflection stared back, distorted by ripples, a sickly magnetism drawing him toward the water. His body leaned forward, his balance slipping. The shadow spread beneath him like a stain, growing darker, hungrier. With a gasp, he jerked back, falling into the bottom of the boat. His head hit the metal with a thud, stars exploding behind his eyes. When he sat up, the whisper was gone. The fog thinned slightly, and the lake's surface was calm once more. But he knew he'd seen something, and it had seen him too. Back on shore, Mark stumbled into the Wrenwood Library, desperate for answers. The old librarian, Mrs. Callahan, raised an eyebrow. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "Maybe I have," Mark replied. "I need to know about the lake, the real stories." Mrs. Callahan's face paled. "You've heard the keeper's call, haven't you?" "The keeper." She sighed and pulled out a dusty ledger. "There's an old legend about Lake Desolate. They say there's a keeper, a spirit that lives beneath the water. It's lonely, always searching for souls to keep it company. Calls to the lost, the vulnerable. And if you hear its call, it doesn't let you go," Mark finished. Mrs. Callahan nodded. "Once the keeper marks you, it's only a matter of time." Mark knew what he had to do. The children were still out there. If he didn't act, more would disappear. Perhaps he would too. He took the boat out one last time, a rope tied around his waist, the other end anchored to the dock. If the keeper wanted him, it would have to fight for him. The fog swallowed him whole as he drifted to the center of the lake. He turned off the motor, letting the silence settle. "I'm here," he said. "Take me, but let the children go." The water rippled. A shape rose from the depths, dark, formless, but with eyes like twin voids. "You offer yourself?" the whisper echoed. "Yes." The shadow reached for him, tendrils of cold water wrapping around his wrists. He felt the pull, the darkness welcoming him. But then a chorus of voices, children's voices. "No." The tendrils loosened. The shadow shuddered. The children were fighting back, their spirits rejecting the keeper's hold. The shadow howled, a sound of anguish and defeat, and dissolved into the water. The fog lifted. Mark awoke on the dock, soaked and shivering. Around him, the missing children lay unconscious but breathing. As the sun rose, the lake sparkled with a light it hadn't seen in years. The darkness was gone. But Mark knew one thing for sure. The keeper was waiting, watching, ready to return when the town forgot. And Wrenwood always forgot.
Thanks for listening to today's story. Let us know what you think. If you want to hear more scary stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here and welcome you.